everyone. I'm Linda Nickell, and welcome to the Happiness Hour. Every week, photographers meet here to connect, inspire, and create. My guests share tips, techniques, and the stories behind their photographs. The schedule for upcoming presentations is on my website at lindanickell.com. And if you haven't subscribed to the Happiness Hour YouTube channel, please check it out for sessions that you may have missed. Tonight's guest is Alyce Bender. Bender is a nature photographer and a Tamron Ambassador. Her vast portfolio includes macro photography subjects such as flowers and insects. She is passionate, and I cannot overemphasize passionate, about sharing unique animals and environments from around the world. And her wildlife photography highlights those special moments that she's documented. But tonight, she'll share her insight into landscape photography in her presentation, The Diverse Landscape. Bender will talk about various landscape photography genres, spanning from the traditional to intimate small scenes and creative landscapes. She'll inspire us to see beyond the epic view and making the most of your time in the field. If you're on Instagram, you can find her at A Bender Photo, and you can connect with her through her website, abenderphotography.com, where you can sign up for her newsletter, and you'll find her schedule of her upcoming workshops. So with that, welcome back to the Happiness Hour, Bender.
Thank you so much once again, Linda, for having me. It's a privilege once again to be joining you on here and sharing information with your viewers. So as Linda so aptly said, I'm a nature photographer. I love doing kind of a bit of everything. A lot of my work is wildlife based, and I know I've been here on the Happiness Hour before with things like macro photography, but I'm really happy to, and this is something that Linda didn't know before, but this particular presentation takes me back kind of to the roots of how I got started in nature photography, because it wasn't just about wildlife when I first started. It was a lot about landscapes, and being from Florida, I loved being able to get away to the mountains to photograph waterfalls. So we're going to get into kind of how I view landscapes and how I break them down throughout various types of landscapes that we might come across in our travels or even in our own backyards. Linda did a really great job introducing me. Yeah, we're just going to skip on past this because I have a lot of information to cover, and I really want you all to hear about the landscape portion. I am currently based out of Las Vegas, but I travel a ton. So I encounter landscapes that go, and I typically call them more scapes because it's also seascapes and working around the ocean, rivers, having that water element as well. It's not just land-based, as we will see. But when I come across a scape, there's three different views that I can take of it. And that's the epic view, which we may have heard of, the intimate view, which has become more and more popular over the last several years, and then the artistic take. And anybody who knows my background may have a guess as to where I might be going with that aspect. In each one of these, I'm going to break down kind of what I look for in an epic, an intimate, or an artistic view. But I'm also going to be discussing compositional considerations, gear selection, and techniques and settings for each of these. And then obviously, if you have any questions that come up, feel free to put them in the chat and I will answer them towards the end of the presentation as we wrap up. So with that being said, let's jump right into the epic landscape. Landscapes in general, take a step back real quick. It's all around us. oftentimes as nature photographers, landscapes are something that draw us into photography to start with, because it's what captures our gaze and what we want to preserve and bring back as memories or bring back as stories when we're out traveling, when we're out hiking, when we're out just, in our backyard, sometimes, in our local parks. And so to me, this is kind of the basis of a lot of photographers' beginnings. And I think that it should be a strong beginning. And so hopefully this presentation will help you on your journey, whether you've already walked that path and are still on that path with landscapes, or it might invigorate you to maybe revisit that portion of your photography. But to me, it's a lot about storytelling, and storytelling is something I talk about throughout, regardless of genre. I feel that images tell stories. And so it's all about telling the story of the landscape of your subject. So we will go into the epic view. This is probably the most, when somebody says a landscape photograph or landscape photography, this is probably what most people think of. This is the grand landscape, that very wide angle. There's depth, there's breadth, there's a lot going on. You can kind of see yourself sitting there and being surrounded by this grand landscape. Kind of why they call it that. And just very rudimentary, the grand landscape really breaks down into finding a landscape view that brings you interest, that captures your attention, and then has certain elements. And for me, those elements include having your strong foreground, a strong midground, and a strong background. For the grand landscape, you really want to have that depth. You really want to have, those details so that the viewer can feel like they are standing there at a precipice in a location, looking out through your camera. Somehow you are taking light, capturing it in this little box of technology that we have created, and through a two-dimensional piece of art, we are then presenting viewers with a three-dimensional location. It's quite magical if you think of it that way. But I typically start my grand landscapes by looking for a very dynamic and interesting foreground. I love using wide angle lenses. So typically I will use, on digital SLRs, going back to, as you can see in this image, this is one of my earlier images with a Nikon D7000. So we're talking a ways back, was a Tamron 10 to 24 millimeter at 10 millimeters. So even now, where I use a Sony A1 and a Sony A7R5 mirrorless camera, I'm still using a Tamron 11 to 20 millimeter lens for a lot of my grand landscapes, because I love being able to emphasize those foregrounds, because to me that allows me to harness my viewer and allow them to basically feel like they have their feet right there at the bottom of my frame and are looking out on this vista that I have presented to them. So for me, it really starts at the foreground and builds upward within the image for a grand landscape. And that goes for, whether you're working around water or not. But for me, this is an older image, but why I bring this up is because while you want a foreground landscapes, I think it's very important that you shoot both horizontally and vertically. Okay. And trying to find those compositions. When it comes to gear, one of the things that I think really, I know that it exponentially helped me to have a dedicated L bracket for my camera. And now I refuse to, when I upgrade my camera, I automatically upgrade my L bracket. Universal L brackets are great to an extent, but they aren't masters at what they do, especially when it comes to allowing you access to some of those ports that you may need on newer cameras. Make sure you have a L bracket that you actually can use, because what that does is instead of having to turn your ball head with your camera to one side or the other to get that vertical shot, it allows you to keep your tripod and your ball head in the same position and then just rotate the camera. So you're not having to compensate your composition for how much your camera leans off of your tripod from where you have it set up. So to me, that's one piece of equipment that is almost necessary when it comes to landscape photography. You can obviously get by without it, but it makes your job, and this is a hobby for those who aren't working as a professional in it, but it makes it that much more enjoyable because it's one less thing you have to worry about. It's so easy to have that L bracket and be able to go back and forth between horizontal and vertical. And then shooting both horizontal and vertical gives you more options on what you want to do with your images once you get them home from the field. It gives you more for your portfolio so that you're not just walking away with one image from a location, you're walking away with multiples. And, you know, depending on the type, you know, if you go on to publish, depending on the type of layout, you may get a cover, which may be vertical. You may get a double page spread, which is horizontal. So what do you want to do with your images in the future? Give yourself the best opportunity by shooting multiple ways when working a environment. It's just like with my macro where I say spend an hour with a flower, see how many images you can create. Do the same with a waterfall. It's much larger. It's much easier to spend an hour with a waterfall, I think. Going beyond that kind of rule of thirds that we all hear in landscape, I think one of the easiest ones that we see where to break the rule is when we have things like reflections and we put the horizon line directly in the middle and we let the composition happen around that horizon line. But this is definitely something that you want to take into consideration, that if you don't necessarily have a symmetrical landscape, is to where you place your horizon line. Typically, I like having it in the lower third or upper third. And most of mine, actually, you will see my horizon line is going to be in the upper third because I like having that large foreground. Others may have, you know, have it more frequently in that lower third because they like having more sky. But it just depends on which landscape you're shooting and what you're going for portfolio wise. In this image, I like it. It's mine. But I use this image as what I consider a supporting landscape image. To me, this is not a grand landscape image in a traditional sense because it doesn't have that impact of a foreground. It doesn't have an impact of a sky. It doesn't really lead you in there, but it does give you a sense of the grander landscape in this position. I use this to support just kind of the storytelling of what it's like to be in Japan in winter. But there's a big difference between something like this and something that has a large foreground where it leads the viewer in and really helps accentuate the depth of the landscape that you are capturing. And like you see here from the Faroe Islands, this was sunrise. And, you know, I really loved how this leading line of the rocks kind of really brings the viewer in. It gives you that kind of sense of, oh, right there in your face, you are there on those rocks and you are then led directly into the image. So it builds that three-dimensional story, even using this two-dimensional media. Another way to do that beyond just having like those direct leading lines like we have with those boulders, is kind of these more ethereal leading lines like you might have here in this lily valley on the coast of California. Here we can see the leading line from my large foreground leading back towards the horizon. And then we also have the valley keeping the viewer's eye in. So again, you have these leading lines that go to a horizon line, lead the viewer in and build that depth, keeping the viewer within the image until they reach that back horizon, that infinity, if you will. When working around the coastlines, I really think I love playing with long exposure. Again, going back to me, some of my first stuff being waterfalls, but around the coastlines, for those who work seascapes, I think it's important to calculate and understand how just wave motion, whether it's coming in or going out, impacts how a viewer will see your image, especially if you are using larger foregrounds where you're low and on the sand, such as in this image. For me, typically I wait until the wave has crashed and is starting to pull back out to see, because what that's going to do is drag that foam and drag that glare and drag that white, reflective lines back into the frame out to sea, which again leads our viewers from where they're standing outside into the frame. Whereas if you have the wave coming in, it's a different feeling. So again, it's about the story that you're wanting told. So if you do want to kind of maybe have that kind of visceral effect on your viewer of pushing them away, maybe you do get a wave kind of crashing towards the beach instead of being pulled back out. But I'm just going to give you half a second here to look real closely. This image has an awful lot of leading lines, even though I think at first glance, people might not see them overall. So I just want you to take a look real quick and see how many of these you picked up at first glance. Because now suddenly we have all these leading lines in the foreground going up between the grasses, between the reflective V that these conifers are making in their reflection, the slight V formation along the back bank of this river, and then the trees that are going up to the mountains. And then we also have in the sky, because of the way that it's framed with those conifers, you have them kind of coming in, and then you also have the peaks that come in and kind of create that W effect, especially with how the sky has capped those mountains. That helps frame and keep the viewer's eye in. Now, granted, when we go to the mountains, we often like to see those peaks, but I think in this situation, we get that moodiness. I don't think that, Grand Teton there actually needed to be fully seen in order to get the effect here. I think actually it would have been less effective had Grand Teton been fully exposed. I really liked how this light was moving across the mountains in a band and how all these leading lines really drew the viewer into this image. So now here you get it for another split second so that you can see those lines all in action now that you've seen them pointed out. You've heard me mention waterfalls several times now, and this is kind of one of the, it's not one of the original images that I started with, but this was one of the first images that I really was happy with, that I actually traveled for. I traveled to the Pacific Northwest in the early 20-teens, I guess, specifically to go photograph waterfalls with a amazing photographer by the name of Gary Randall. And I I think waterfalls fall into an interesting niche because I feel like they straddle both grand landscape and intimates. And so to me, it's a matter of how you use the waterfall within the scene as to kind of which category they fit in. To me, with this being kind of the full waterfall being from, where it drops off of the rock so you can see the top, it being set back with the large foreground. To me, I would put this in, and I have put this in the category of grand landscape. There's depth here, there's breadth. Wide angle, you've got a large foreground, and you can see the entirety of your waterfall. Same goes for here, where once again, it doesn't have those massive boulders that the last one did, but you still got a large foreground that a viewer can place themselves in. You've got this waterfall here that is supported by everything else around it. It is the subject, but there's so much more going on beyond just the waterfall in this scene. Again, left up to interpretation. These do it's kind of personal interpretation as to which category you might put your waterfall images in. And we'll see a couple others that I've put in the intimate landscape here coming up as well. So we'll be able to see some of the differences as to why I chose these as grand landscapes and those as intimates. Going beyond the foreground, to me, the next piece that falls into a grand landscape is going to be the sky. It's going to be what's considered the background in many of your images. And to me, it's just as important because you can have a really interesting foreground, a really interesting midground where your viewer is going, and then you have a sky that's just leaving you hanging because maybe there's nothing there. It's why sky replacements have become so popular with technology making it as easy as it is to replace skies nowadays, because we know how important having an interesting sky can be. So again, for me, oftentimes my horizon line is at the 2/3 mark when going from top to bottom. So my sky isn't taking up a ton of real estate within the image, but it still takes up real estate, and it's still an important element. It's still that remaining third of the story. And so it needs to be there. This image would not work if I just had a blank sky. The drama would not be there. The repetitive pattern between the pockmarks in the coral in this, along with those patchy clouds, they wouldn't complement each other if that sky was just blank, So again, paying attention to skies and going out there and capturing them when there's interesting skies is really important when it comes to the grand landscape. And it's what can make things very difficult, especially when traveling, if you only have a set number of days or even hours within a certain location. Frequently, when we talk about skies, what we're really talking about is weather and atmosphere, though. And so that is what you want to do if you are really working on a grand landscape portfolio, is you want to be watching the weather, and you're going to want to research your atmospheric conditions for certain areas that you might be visiting. It's why so many photographers come out to the desert Southwest during monsoon season, because that's when the most dramatic skies are going to happen. The landscapes are going to be there year round, but the skies are going to be the ones that are changing. So in this case, this was at the Green River Overlook. And over the course of just a couple hours, I sat and watched storms roll through. And this is a series of images, all from the same overlook, that I was able to capture as the skies changed. And all I did was move around this one overlook and got a ton of different images. And so it was just a matter of waiting for the light, changing my composition, working the scenes with different lenses. I even got double rainbows at the end, because where you have light and you have rain, you often have rainbows. So waiting it out, it was really interesting because often these storms, they did have thunder, but they were miles off. And I didn't get rained on. I could see where it was raining, but I had the whole overlook to myself because as soon as the first sound of thunder came, everybody who was there left. And it was just me, my RV, and my two dogs. And I just had it to myself for hours in Canyonlands, which is like unheard of. It was great. And then you have places that are not necessarily seasonally angry, if you will, if you want to give a moody tone to it. Places like the Faroe Islands, where you can spend days, weeks, months photographing clouds and storms as they move over the islands. And you get just so much action happening, whether it's rain, whether it's mist, whether it's just low clouds moving over this craggy, rocky, storm chiseled cliffs that the Faroe Islands are as they sit in the North Atlantic Sea. In situations like this, what I like trying to do is if I know that I'm going to be photographing for where I have light popping through the clouds for this very dynamic range, I try and wait to see where I can get a pop of light before it hits the scene that I want. And I'll meter off of that so that as soon as it gets to my scene in this situation, in this scene, before it actually hit this position, I wanted to capture the light beforehand so that I could meter and have my settings so that as soon as it hit over here, I would be very close to where I needed to be for exposure. Because when dealing with clouds, you're dealing with very bright highlights. And if you aren't ready for that, if you haven't metered for that, you can oftentimes blow those out and those highlights can't be recovered. So you do want to be aware and be thinking ahead when photographing moody weather, especially in fast moving and fast changing conditions. And stormy weather is also when it's great to take advantage of long exposures and allowing clouds to move, letting, in this case, letting the waves and the storm really kind of move this whole thing. I mean, this is a massive waterfall and you can see that flume because of all the wind that was being, starting to pull that waterfall to the side just with the wind. The Faroe Islands are well known for their waterfalls that will flow back up because the winds will be so strong going up the cliff face that the waterfalls actually start flowing up again. So I really encourage you to take the time when there is moody weather to really explore your options when it comes to the grand landscape and using things like long exposure to give yourself that moody setting and emphasize those clouds, that storminess, with some of that motion. It's a great dichotomy to have that it's a great juxtaposition between having, a hard, craggy landscape with the softening of, in this case, waves, but as well as those clouds. So that adds to the interest within the story where you have that soft and hard, just like when you have complementary colors. And then you have where it all comes together and you're able to get the clouds, the background, your midground, your point of interest, as well as your foreground. And we all do this, but try not to. Don't be like me in this situation where I saw all this happening. I had packed up early. Don't do that, especially with landscapes. Don't pack up early because then it'll happen and you then go running off down the trail and have to do things like handhold an exposure like this. It's much better to be set up on a tripod where you can work and scene, though nowadays with technology and the way that cameras are and ISO sensitivity, you can do a lot of hand holding. And I'm very much a big proponent for hand holding. But it does help to be able to work a scene and not just be going for the Hail Mary as you run down a trail, hoping you find something that will work. So, one thing I do want to touch on with grand landscapes before we move on is, especially in the desert Southwest, I hear a lot of people, oh, well, you go out at sunrise, you go out at sunset, and that's it. I think there's a very big missed opportunity when it comes to midday, especially if you have any sort of clouds in the sky. But even if you don't, thinking of, when you're in high contrast situations, if you can start thinking in black and white, or just if you have a hard time thinking about it that way, then maybe turning your camera, most of them will have a setting in them that allows you to see in black and white, kind of have that kind of preset. It'll still capture all the information as a raw file, but you'll be able to see it on the back of your camera as black and white. And that may help you visualize a black and white setting with the contrast that harsher light presents itself as. Putting a polarizer on in the desert really turns those blue skies really dark. Just make sure you don't have that banding. So you really want to make sure, if you're using a polarizer and it's flat blue skies, that your sun is at your shoulders. Okay. That's going to be the big key. Otherwise you can get some this gradient that's very hard to fix in post, if not almost impossible. But this was kind of me channeling my inner Ansel Adams here in the desert with that dark sky and going black and white with all those leading lines. But now let's take a step back, because grand landscapes also almost broke me. I almost set my camera down because I was having such a hard time finding a traditional grand landscape that it really was bothering me. And it was very disheartening to see, on social media and these other photographers that I followed, they were getting all these great grand landscapes, and I just couldn't seem to do it myself. And it got to a point where I was so discouraged, I did think seriously about putting my camera away. And it took a while for me to really get back to, well, I got into photography when I was knee-high to explore nature through the lens. And so that's where I went back to. I went back to just exploring. And a vast amount of nature is not about a grand landscape. Oftentimes it's these small scenes that we see all around us, that we see, that bring us joy, that bring us interest, that, pique our allow us either a moment of peace or, pique our interest to go further into a location. And to me, that's the intimate view. That's capturing these small scenes as we find them throughout nature. So here's an example of, it could go, it kind of straddles the line, but I'll call it in this situation a grand landscape where we have the sky, the sea, and a monolith. But let's look at it from more of an intimate landscape perspective. And suddenly we get more images like this and this. So now I've taken what would be one grand landscape, because you can only go in this location, you can only go so wide. You can't get around on either side of that monolith because it's in the sea. So if you were there for a grand landscape, that's kind of it, that very first image. But as you start breaking down the scene into these more intimate landscapes, you can start working both sides of the keyhole as the light comes through. And there was even more if you worked further down the beach and things like that. So it really kind of drives not only the idea that nature is not just this grand view where we pull over on the side of the road and we can see for miles and miles and miles, but it's also this idea that it's these smaller scenes, these glimpses that we get that are special, that are unique, and bringing those back as well. I'm going to misquote on purpose. a little quote here, and that is to see the trees for the forest. Um, in this case, I really like going into the forest and trying, they're very, very hard to photograph, but for me, being able to go in and kind of pick out the trees that I particularly like and find ways to frame them rather than trying to get everything in the image. I just want to pick out a few things and then layer them and let those layers go back. Yes, we know this is a forest and look at all those beautiful colors, but really this is about these trees and the interaction that they have between the oranges and the yellows. And kind of bringing the viewer into the center of the frame. Or here in the Hoh rainforest up in Washington, where it's not even necessarily about the trees, it's about the ferns, it's the understory. It's you know, we know we're in a forest, but I don't need to show you the trees for that. You get the sense of that just by seeing this small scene where we have these large ferns taking up much of the foreground, and you have these overarching now I'm forgetting the type of little tree these are. Anyways, you have all these branches that are creating this framing, this beautiful framing over the fronds of the ferns. Creating just, you know, and then you have kind of this slight leading line going off just slightly to the right. So your viewer has a place to kind of meander in further into the forest as if there is a place for them to go further to explore. Forests can also often be overwhelming just in their sheer size. It can be really hard that, you know, if we're trying to photograph trees and they're, you know, 60, 80 feet tall, it can be very hard to capture. If I was just taking a picture of one of these trees at their base, it would just be a block of wood basically in a picture. It would be living, but it would just be, you know, a block. So by looking up, I'm able to give a viewer more of that feeling of how I feel when I'm standing in the snowy forest of these Japanese pines, these Japanese cedars, and I'm looking upwards, you know, on a quiet morning and just kind of being in awe as these giants stand over me. So perspective within the intimate landscape, I think, plays a much more important role. You can definitely see it visually that there is a wider range of perspectives in the intimate scene than you do in the grand landscape because you can look up, down, side to side, and it's all going to be different even in the same landscape. So many of us chase lone trees. I am one of them. I love lone trees. They can be put in a grand landscape as a supporting actor or in an intimate landscape where they are the subject. In this situation, I have used the atmospheric conditions of fog in the early morning to obliterate, you know, there was nothing, you couldn't see the mountains that are normally behind this. There's normally mountains behind this tree and fields that continue to roll. But because the fog was so dense, you just get this sense of a single tree in a spring field with the clouds over it, creating for a much more intimate landscape than if you were able to see, you know, the foothills and then the mountains that you would get here in the Smoky Mountains if that fog was not there. Or in this situation where on the South Carolina coast, where I did include foreground, but you get a much more almost portrait-like appearance of this single tree. It's a boneyard tree where, because the sea has come into where it was growing, it's essentially driftwood that's still standing. Using a neutral density filter, 10-stop neutral density filter, I was able to use a 30-second exposure. So really allowing those clouds to smear across the sky. Again, I was lucky they were moving away from the coast. So you get that kind of draw out along with the waves that were also kind of coming in and then going back out during that exposure. So you get all of this drawing the viewer into the image towards the horizon, along with that kind of portrait of this particularly interesting, at least to me, tree that's obviously seen things. So. But also intimate landscapes when working around water and reflections, looking and seeing what the reflections can tell a viewer about your scene without having to include it. So here I just include the base of these cypress trees along the Frio River in Texas. But then because of the way there's the reflections, our viewer does get kind of an idea that these trees do go much further up and there's canopy. And so it's this idea that there is more to the image, that this is just a very small segment, that this is a glimpse of what this landscape holds. So it adds a bit of mystery to a landscape if you only give people just a piece, a teaser. It's a trailer to the grand landscape. But it doesn't necessarily always have to be small. I think sometimes we get honed in on, oh, well, these scenes must be just small little pieces like we saw in that last one of the Frio River. But yet this image here covers miles. But I was on a ferry, and I still think this to me speaks intimately of the landscape. It doesn't have a huge foreground that welcomes a viewer into it like we saw with some of those grand landscapes. It's very much just about the sea, the land, the sky, and the light. And because there's not a whole lot of detail, because it's all, the land is in shadow, you have the stormy clouds, it feels more intimate. So I think there's also a bit more about the intention, the artists, how they created the artists, what they are trying to convey, whether is it all about, oh, look at how much we can see, we're at F22, or we've, stacked a bunch of images to create all of this depth, or is it something more like this, where it's like, look at that single band of light that's just intertwined with these islands under the stormy sky. Or here, where it's most definitely about the sky, allowing the mountainside to go fully into shadow and silhouette and just allowing it to be about that sky. In the Southwest, I was lucky enough several years ago to be just outside Monument Valley when they got snow. And in the early morning, I used one of my favorite tools called the U-turn. And it's free, comes standard on all vehicles. And I know that joke gets old for anybody who's traveled with me, but I still love it. But using the U-turn, I was able to pull over, and I just love the simplicity of this, because you get the color, because the snow in the shadow is reflecting such a brilliant blue because of the blue sky against that orange rock. And I'm originally from Gainesville, Florida. So if any of you know anything about that, orange and blue are the colors I grew up with. So it's what I'm drawn to. And so I really loved the way that these lines were, and with that snow and those contrasting colors, it was really a nice scene that I couldn't pass up. Or here, where when I was in Japan, I was scouting some mountain trails, and this happened to be just a overlook that you could pull over, and there was this pond down below surrounded by these trees. And I just loved how it was just kind of out there for anybody to see. And it didn't take having the whole mountain range in the image for me. It was all about this pond that was completely surrounded. There was like no hint that people had been there, even though obviously, I mean, I was looking down on it. I knew that there were trails, but there was no, there's no docks or anything here. It's just, it seems very pristine. When working with rivers and streams, frequently I will photograph upstream, looking upstream. If I'm able to stand over it, because then the water is flowing towards me. And I think viewers tend to feel like, oh, well, I can just like go upstream. At least for me, it's a natural thing. I want to go upstream to start with. When I'm exploring, I typically go upstream. Maybe it's because I'm hunting for those waterfalls, but so I like doing that. Then the water flows naturally from the top of the frame to the bottom of the frame. Or if I'm photographing them horizontally, typically I like to photograph them with the water leading out one of the bottom corners. That's just my personal preference. I've found that if you photograph where the water is, if you're like looking down the river, I feel it doesn't have the same effect that the ocean drawing you in. It feels like it slides your viewer out of the frame much too quickly. They don't have time to enjoy it. Whereas here you get a little bit of that tension, like your viewer's trying to go in and it's pushing back. So you kind of have this tension between the viewer and the water. Whereas if you had one where it was looking down this river rapid, that you just kind of, there's no resistance. And so your viewer's just able to go in and then slip out the other side. But we talked about waterfalls kind of having this overlay between grand landscape and intimate landscape. And so here are a couple examples of what I think are more intimate landscapes of waterfalls. So in this situation, I start with this, and this is, we see the full waterfall, but we don't have that big that grand landscape foreground like we did with that first waterfall that we saw, where we had those huge boulders. Or in this situation where, yes, we have a much more defined foreground, but we don't have the full waterfall. We're just catching a glimpse of it. This is a waterfall in the Columbia River Gorge that stands over 200 feet tall. I'm not capturing all of that waterfall. And so you kind of are left with this mystery of exactly how tall is it? Where does it go? Or here again, where I get another one in Oregon, where it's just a piece of the waterfall that's then supported by all of this fall foliage to give you that seasonal flavor. And when working waterfalls with, I frequently will start much like with a snowy landscape, where I start large and then work my way in smaller, because I don't want to accidentally step or move something that I might want in my foreground. You know, if I accidentally bump a leaf or something that I might want when I'm walking up, if I start close and then work my way back, I may have disturbed something that I might have wanted in my image beforehand, or left a footprint where I don't want it. So for me, I typically will start back and move forward. And so here I have a larger one. Again, I put this in more of the intimate because I feel like it's, you've got, yes, a large waterfall, but you don't see the top of it. You kind of have this kind of closer feeling. You don't see what's on either side of the waterfall very much. So to me, speaks more to the intimate, though I know that it could potentially fall into a grand landscape as well. This one to me definitely is more intimate. You have that large foreground, but you don't have anywhere close to the full waterfall effect, and you don't have anything on the side of the waterfall. It is all about the waterfall and this cascade at the base of it. So, and this is from that last frame to this is me walking up past that log that I photographed in the first frame. Or here again, the base of a waterfall, and just allowing the fall to kind of, instead of trying to capture it all, just the interesting portion at the bottom with the various little tributaries and all the moss. But even grand and large landscapes, such as those found in Iceland, I think can be photographed intimately. Here we have it kind of hidden by earth in the folds. You know, this is one of the largest ones. I know everybody's seen images. I am not good at pronouncing Icelandic names, so I'm not going to try on this one. But I think the sheep on the hill give it scale, but it still looks very intimate. And this was using telephoto and being able to compress the scene and kind of allowing that foreground fold, that cliff line in the front to come over that, kind of screening it, much like you would maybe have a lady hold a shawl, giving it kind of a more intimate feel rather than just having it right in your face as such an epic, large waterfall that it is. And then moving beyond forests and water for those of us in the desert. Again, the desert is a place that, you know, we do get a lot of grand landscapes, but we also have a lot of smaller ones. So in Monument Valley, this doesn't scream Monument Valley, but this is where I took it. And to me, this is kind of one of those smaller scenes that I really enjoy. I like the orange with the blue. I like the eye, this idea that you have all these lines kind of sloping through diagonally through the image. And it's just kind of a quiet scene, something that might not necessarily pique everybody's attention. But to me, this was something that stuck with me from that location. And then we have the kingdom of intimate scenes, Antelope Canyons. So popular that they don't do photography tours anymore. At least not in Upper and Lower Canyon on any regular basis, because you can go in there with your cell phones, but not tripods anymore. But these got really popular because it's stuff that people don't usually see. These slot canyons are so unique, and the scenes are, you know, everywhere you look is a scene because it's those intimate landscapes. And then you have assisted landscapes where you have some very helpful guide who puts a bowl of sand up along a rock and allows it to run down and gives you sand falls within the canyons. So beautiful place, lots and lots of these small scenes with great leading lines, great color, and just a wealth of showcasing what you can do when you look for those small scenes in areas. And it's not just about the color, though I do love the color, because you can do so much in black and white in slot canyons as well. So again, it's another place to also be thinking beyond the color, be thinking in the lines and shapes and shadows. We also have places like Death Valley, where you have a lot of the topography, Death Valley, all over Utah, these desert areas where you have this topography that is almost devoid of plant material, but you have so much texture, you have so many lines, and it can make for some amazing intimate landscapes when you frame it in just a small scene and allow a viewer to wonder about the rest of the landscape. You're not giving it away. It's a small piece. And then you have sand dunes. And sand dunes can go either way, again, depending on how they're photographed, right? We've seen so many images out there of landscapes that are grand landscapes featuring sand dunes. And yet then you have images like this that are sand dunes in an intimate scene that are just kind of ethereal and on their own. Or you go more abstract with it and you allow the sand dunes in color and sand and sky. And you use that plain late afternoon flat blue sky to really just emphasize the lines and the shape that the sand dunes create for a more intimate feel rather than a grand landscape of the sand dunes. And this one kind of borders on macro, but I think that also is still part of the intimate landscape, is really going small and looking at some of those really fine details. And this is just a very small segment of a sand dune ridge, one side in light, one in shadow, and showing those lines and that texture in the sand. There's places in the Southwest with slot canyons, as we discussed. And I think approaching them much like you would tall forests with perspective is also important. So it's not just about how the slots can go in, but also looking up. And with intimate landscapes, there's also a place for long lenses as well to compress a scene. This was dawn just outside of Phoenix, and being able to compress those layers while getting that beautiful array of light of color as it came up against the shadowed mountains. But perspective is key, I think, when it comes to intimate landscapes and finding a unique perspective to tell your story. I've shared this image before. It's one of my favorites. It always makes me smile, and I always think of this as kind of what it would look like from a bug's hammock if bugs put up hammocks. And it always just kind of makes me smile. And I know that the people who are around me, this was taken in Japan, they thought I was very weird because this is a canola field and the farmer had mowed a maze, much like we do corn mazes, they do canola mazes, so that they can enjoy the flowers before they're harvested. And I was laying down in the dirt. I mean, my camera was down in the dirt, no tripod, no nothing, like base in the dirt, looking up to capture this. So I know, but it makes me smile. It's a different perspective. And panoramas can go both ways, grand landscape or intimate. I urge you, if you're going to do panoramas, photograph them vertically so that you have more pixels. You'll take more images to capture the whole scene, but it means that you'll have more information to work with as you put that panorama together in post. So instead of trying to capture a wide angle shot and then cut off the top and or bottom, take verticals that cover the entire span and stitch them together. Lightroom makes it super easy, or if you're a Photoshop user, it makes it super easy. So I urge you to do that when working with panoramas, but we know about them in grand landscape. I like pointing them out here in the intimate landscape as well, because I think they're often overlooked. And it's not just about things like stream beds here, but also using a telephoto and really photographing, when you have moody weather moving in over mountain ranges and picking out those spots of light where you have interesting formations as well. All right. And last but not least, and for anybody who really knows me, you probably figured this one out, the artistic take. This is where I love playing with my landscapes. It's more appropriate than playing with your food, so I encourage everybody to do it. But this is kind of what I love doing, just kind of trying to figure out how I can baffle viewers. This is not AI, this is not graphic design, this is an actual photograph. And here's a larger, slightly wider version of the same scene. So now maybe it brings in a little bit more context, where this is sand dunes, where the dune closest to me was actually in shadow and the one behind was still in sun. So in order to get this, I rotated my camera so that I had the image. So I had that dune line going from corner to corner, but then I focused on the shadowed dune so that my farther dune went out of focus, so you don't get those sand lines to give it away. And I used a shallow depth of field to just photograph along that dune ridge. So if you were to actually look in the shadows, there is some detail here to give you a hint, but otherwise, when people first look at it, it's more very much minimalist, abstract, but it's a landscape. Or here where you get curvatures and you just play with tonality, white sands, sand dunes in New Mexico is a place I love doing this with. Just because the white sands really reflect whatever color is in the sky, and there's so many lines out there. It's a great place for a long lens and just taking your time to wander through. with wildflowers using selective focus to focus through flowers. So here I actually had flowers touching my front element that I'm photographing through, focusing on the distant flowers and allowing those flowers that are close to my lens to just completely go out of focus and create this bokeh of color around the frame of the image. Intentional camera movement. This has been one that, you know, a lot of people have been doing. And it's what it sounds like. This is a image taken still of the same frame and then moving the camera during the exposure allows me to smooth out those details while still capturing what I consider the bones of the image, those structural lines along with the color. Or here where I was actually out photographing acorn woodpeckers in Yosemite and I was waiting for them to come back with their acorns to their stash tree, and I saw this stand of trees, and I decided to photograph it in two ways because it was winter and I just loved the way they looked. So I did a little bit of intentional camera movement, just enough to kind of blur some of the details here, but then also going a little bit faster and changing where I started and ended so you could see the snow at the bottom of the trees. Same trees, two different ways of photographing it just based on the speed at which I move the camera. We've all heard of Arches National Park, I'm sure, because now they've been requiring reservations, and reservations have now started once again for entrance to the park this year. This is my favorite photo from Arches National Park from the time I visited. And it is actually where two sandstone fins stand in the Devil's Garden with a blue sky with a wisp of cloud in between. Using intentional camera movement, I created this image. It is not a waterfall. It is not water. It is stone and sky. So playing with your exposures, playing while you're out in the field, going beyond just the traditional images, I think is really important. When you're working with those river scenes, maybe taking that long lens that you were carrying and putting it on a long exposure and just focusing on how the water is reflecting in certain ways. Or trying to find the little rapids and take a whole series. And when you get home, see what type of other images you see within those river rapids, because this is my river rat. Because to me, it looks like there's a little wizened old rat here in the water. This was fall colors. So you have reflection of oranges from the trees, blue from the sky, and then you have the white little rapids, and you've got the rat's nose here in the top third on the right, and then it kind of, the line goes up. You have his ears, his back line, then he goes out of the frame and his tail comes back into the frame at the lower edge. So it's my little river rat. And then this one, this is you're the artist. So I also encourage you to present images as you want them presented. Here, the first thing I saw was a rabbit jumping. And then Google suggested a shy horse. And I said, oh, I see that too. And what it really is was after dark, after sunset, this was the last reflected light in Sedona on a tiny little creek. And so you can see the color is reflecting off of the orange cliff lines into the river. And I did a long exposure. But because I saw the rabbit, I present it vertically. And then Google was like, hey, did you see the horse? And I said, I do now. And so now we have a rabbit and a horse instead of a river. So with that, I appreciate your time. I appreciate Linda so much for hosting this and having me on again. And I hope you have learned a little bit about how I approach my landscapes, from the grand landscape to the intimate landscape and all the way down to what I like to do when I play while out in the landscape. And so I'd love to open it up to questions at this time.
Yes, I do have a couple of those. So, okay, so first of all, let me just say, I knew your grand landscapes were in, you know, were going to hit me in a way that I'm like, ah, I need to travel again. But your artistic ones they were just, those are things that, I aspire to get better at. And it's so fun to see people do them. And it really just kind of gets those creative juices a little bit moving from me. So when we look at very common things, sand, and you can take so many pictures of it up close, far, but and the beauty of it is you can't recreate that shot that you just took. And that's what's so interesting to me, because it just keeps that creativity just rolling. It just fuels you for the next batch of photos that you want to take. So thank you for sharing so many of those beautiful ones. All right, I have a couple of questions that two ladies in here, Gail and Kathy, wanted to know, do you do any focus stacking?
No,
Okay.
no. I actually am going to try my first one. Here I have some images that I did of Astro a week or so ago that I'm going to try my first one, my first image stacking.
Okay.
But focus stacking, no, I'm normally at F20, F22, and I'm okay with that.
Okay. That makes it a little easier. And then the question that Angela has, she's wondering, do you know if anyone makes an L bracket? I'm sorry, if anyone makes an L bracket that allows you to hold an air tag inside them. Ooh, that's
That I don't know. I'm not an Apple person, so I
ooh,
don't have air tags. So yeah, so I'm not sure.
yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, Angela, if you run across one, let me know because I would certainly buy one.
I think you're still going to run into the issue of weight and size and where they're going to be able to put that on a camera that's not going to block a port. So
Yeah.
I don't know if it's been done yet or not.
Okay. Well, maybe somebody will get a great idea and run with it because I do like my air tags. All right. I'm a little addicted to air tags. Okay. I don't see any other questions in here.
I I'm seeing one that came to me as a direct message, and it was somebody asking, what does CPL? And I think it was on some of my images, what does CPL stand for? And I just real quick, that's circular polarizer. So
Perfect. All right. I don't see anything in the general chat, so I think we're good. Thank you so much for coming back again.
of course, always my pleasure. It has been wonderful. Thank you all so very much.
Yeah, thank you. All right, next week, artist in residence Emma Barrera will be here to present Photographing National Parks at Night. Until next time, go out and create something beautiful. And I hope that we see you again soon.